Kati Hornung, Director of Vote Equality, a non-partisan group that has been working to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. They're part of a large movement fighting to add the 28th Amendment to the US Constitution that would guarantee equal legal rights for all citizens, regardless of sex. But why has it taken so long to ratify the ERA? Why is it so important? And what's next? From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Katie, it's great to have you with us. As we heard there, it's been a long fight to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, really going back since the founding of the Constitution, since it was first written. But today is very timely in this timeline because there is, as we speak, debate happening right now in the House around the timeline and extending or eliminating the timeline for ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. Before we get into the history and actually the nuts and bolts of what the ERA is all about, what exactly is happening right now as we speak?
So today in the House of Representatives, and they'll be taking a vote, a roll call vote. We suspect that this should pass pretty easily. It will be heavily on the party lines, but we do expect a few Republicans to join all the Democrats on this vote.
So today's vote would essentially allow the fight for the ERA to be ratified to continue and remove this arbitrary timeline. Now, your organization has emerged from the workings of activists just like you in the three states that were the final three states to come on board, Illinois, Nevada, and Virginia, Virginia being the 38th state. And 38 states were needed to push this forward. Yet there are states who have signed on to this, who are now working to backtrack a little bit. So take us through what's happening at a state level.
So at a state level, there are 12 states that have not ratified. In almost every single one of those states, there is a group on the ground working to get their state house to take up the ratification. They're at various levels in that process. But then also up in North Dakota, there is an effort to what they would call rescind the ratification or sunset, have a sunset clause on their ratification. There are 5 previous states have done that. However, the legal precedent is clear. Ratification is one way. Rescissions mean nothing. We have 3 amendments in the Constitution where there were supposed rescissions that were ignored and the amendments were added. So it'd be kind of confusing to have a constitutional amendment process where you could say yes on one day and no on another. So it's really just a one-way street.
Well, let's get to the heart of what the Equal Rights Amendment is all about. And really, it is what it says it is. It's to guarantee equal rights for everybody. I think many people are shocked that this is not part of the Constitution already. What exactly is the ERA calling for? What would it mean if this were to become the 28th Amendment?
Yeah, so about 80% of Americans think it's already in the Constitution. It's 24 simple words. Equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. These words are actually taken almost exactly from the 19th Amendment. They had some other words back in 1923 and in about the 40s. They said, you know what, let's just simplify it. Let's keep it 24 simple words. Out of all those words, only 6 are new to the Constitution, which is just equality of rights under the law. And when you break it apart, because it's going into the Constitution, it means that it is going to be directly applied for government action only. And all it is really guaranteeing is that it's a non-discrimination clause and that it gives the courts a kind of a new framework to look at. Currently, gender discrimination gets treated differently than race, religion, or country of origin discrimination. And because of that, we really need to really have this reset button for our country and move it forward.
Give us some examples of the protections that are missing and how that's playing out in real life for people in the US right now because the ERA has not yet been ratified.
Yeah, so it's really it's simple everyday things. Like, for example, our government funds research on medicines. However, those researchers do not have to include women in their studies, and so frequently they don't. And we end up with a whole process of medicines being approved for use in the United States. And the very first time it's hitting women is when it's already approved and out there on the shelves. So this kind of gender discrimination it really shows up in so many places. It's all over the place. Another great example that's really easy for people to understand is the rape kit backlog in the United States. Show me a set of evidence of crimes against men that's not being, processed. And in that situation, you can see, okay, here's crimes against women in large numbers where it's not being taken seriously, it's not being processed. And that has gotten a lot more play lately in the media, and states are taking that more seriously. However, if we had the Equal Rights Amendment, that would have been unconstitutional from the get-go.
So often it's framed as a discussion that this is something for women. And you've given a couple of examples there where women really are at the heart of those two issues. And yet this really isn't just about women. Obviously, trans folks, non-binary folks, but men as well would benefit from this. So why should everybody, and not just women, be concerned about the Equal Rights Amendment?
Yeah, so the wording is beautiful in its simplicity and its gender neutrality. One of our local lawyers here in Richmond, from a really big firm, his comment was that one of the very first things that the Equal Rights Amendment is going to do is it's going to provide paternity leave equal to maternity leave. And of course, there was a big groan amongst all the feminists working on this that, okay, so we do all these things and men get it too. However, if you look at the Nordic countries, there's no advantage to hiring a man over a woman because their paternity and maternity leaves are identical. So it helps all of us when we move towards a more equal future. And as far as LGBTQIA plus people in America, we had always hoped, our team had always hoped that we could say, yes, this will definitely include and be a fully inclusive amendment. And once we had the Bostock decision in June of 2020, now we can affirmatively say a Supreme Court with a 6-3 decision said that sex includes everything. It includes whether you're a lesbian or a gay man. It includes somebody who's transitioning. It includes men. It includes women. So this really is for all of us. And one of the things I've noticed when we're out working on college campuses is frequently college students are not all that interested necessarily in talking about women's rights, but they're very interested in their LGBTQIA plus friends and their rights. So when we start talking about the Equality Act, we can pass all the legislation we want, but if it doesn't have a hook into the Constitution, it can get undone at the Supreme Court level. So this really is for all of us, and we all have to be working for equality.
Well, as we said, this is being debated as we speak, Katie, on the floor of the House, whether or not to remove this timeline around the ratification of the ERA. People may be following hashtag ERA now or hashtag ERA, and the tweets are fast and furious coming in. And many are identifying the fact that this is happening once again along party lines, where Democrats tweeting their support, and many Republicans are saying no, vote no on the ERA. And one of the reasons that they're putting their no vote forward is around the issue of abortion. Now, of course, reproductive rights and access to abortion is really central to women's health care. What is the connection between that and the ERA? And why is this argument getting trotted out consistently by Republicans as their reason to oppose the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment?
Yeah, Republicans have what I would call a few boogeyman arguments about the ERA. And in my opinion, they are attempting to stop all change in our culture by trying to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. Back in the 70s, they did this about the draft, women in the military, gay marriage. They actually didn't hit abortion so hard as a topic back then. Well, society moves along, whether or not we give people equality of rights in the courtroom. And so here we are today, women are serving in the military. We have legalized gay marriage. So now they're kind of left with abortion as their last talking point, and they hit it really hard. And I think at some point we have to look at that and say, is it really what we want to say as a society, that all of the gender inequality that is experienced in America, whether it's pay equity, whether it's healthcare, whether it's, rapes, beatings, murders. So all of that inequality that's on the one side, and you're going to outweigh all of that with just one medical procedure. So, I personally reject the argument wholeheartedly, because I feel like I am far more, and my life's experience is far more than just, my ability to have children. So, it's kind of an antiquated argument. I personally wish they would move on, because what I really think they're doing is kind of pinning themselves into a smaller and smaller kind of focus group, because equality is very, very popular in America. I think it's something like 97% of Americans, agree or strongly agree that we should have gender equality in our Constitution. And then it's something like 87% think we should just go ahead and add the 28th Amendment and just get it done. So, I'm always wondering, like, what silo are you living in that you want to just hit this one argument so much and ignore how popular this is for all of America?
Well, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court with the 3 Trump appointees on there, and those appointees being very much supported by conservatives who have been gunning around this issue of abortion access, what would the ERA then do if we're seeing abortion rights, as we are seeing them being challenged in many states? What would the ERA do around abortion access?
So all that the Equal Rights Amendment is it is a non-discrimination clause. It goes into our Constitution, and now, the judicial branch now has a new framework of no discrimination based on gender. So they're going to now bump this framework against any specific case that comes up. No single constitutional right is absolute, and they do all get bumped up against each other. And so what you would see is what we see already. Every single case is going to get legislated and litigated. It's going to come from both sides, and we're going to kind of continue within, I like to think of it like a bowling ball going down the lane. We have bumpers up on the sides, and things just kind of ping pong a little bit in between. And all this does is it provides a new set of bumpers that will help them say, at what point is this gender discrimination? On any given case, they're just going to be looking at it from all these different constitutional rights, and they're going to have to weigh the different rights against each other in making those decisions.
Now, we are in the middle of a global health pandemic that has significantly impacted some members of our society, much more than others. And women and children, once again, and particularly women and children of colour, are bearing the brunt of this. With regards issues like the economic impact of the coronavirus, compounding the existing gender pay gap. And once again, women of colour, and particularly Black women, really still so badly discriminated against when it comes to that. What would the Equal Rights Amendment do for that? Because I know on your website for vote equality, you've broken it down, even the economics of this, how much not ratifying the ERA is costing us. So when we look at this through, say, an economic lens, what's the situation?
We are basically giving up about $3 trillion in our kind of our national, whatever the GDP. And when we don't have equality, that's kind of the level that we are shorting ourselves by. Now, that's a pre-COVID number. COVID has been devastating to women and children in particular. And so I suspect that number now, if somebody was going to do a fresh study, would actually be higher. In particular, I would like to point for people to consider the fact that in the there's a court case challenging, that the Equal Rights Amendment needs to be added to the Constitution. Over 100 corporations, including huge names like a Google and a Microsoft and a Smith Barney, as well as smaller names like Chobani and Tiffany and Levi Strauss. All these companies are coming together and saying, if we're going to recover from the coronavirus and recover fair and square and be back at a new healthy normal, we have to have the Equal Rights Amendment.
So what is next? We're having this vote as we speak on the House. This would essentially remove this arbitrary timeline to say that the clock has run out on ratifying the ERA, it all needs to start again. It is expected that the House will vote in favour to remove that timeline. So that process will continue. But what are some of the next steps?
So the next steps are going to be for the Senate then to take it up. Nothing's done with just one chamber. Obviously, we have to have both chambers make basically the same arguments and vote it through. We know that we have a majority of senators in support of removing this arbitrary deadline. So it's really just a matter of getting it to the floor of the Senate. I'm not sure of the timing on that. We're actually going to be meeting with Senator Cardin's office later this week. He's the key. He and Lisa Murkowski carry it together. So it's a bipartisan carry. They are trying to get as much support as possible. From my perspective, I would like to see this go through with a huge level of support, because at the end of the day, no matter what, we're going to end up in the courts on this one. And the more that we can be making a lot of noise around the country that this is a good thing, we're all supportive of this, the more that we can hold our legislators responsible for actually doing the work that we want them to do the things that are popular with your constituents. That's the kind of thing that's going to make us move this forward in a way that when it eventually hits the Supreme Court, and it will eventually hit the Supreme Court, that they can take notice of what does the Main Street say, what does Wall Street say, and what has the Congress said.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers if you are paying attention to what's going on with the Equal Rights Amendment. Maybe you are one of the many Americans who are surprised that this is in fact not actually part of the Constitution. Let us know what you're thinking and maybe what's happening in your particular state. And Katie, as I said, your group has emerged from grassroots activism in different states. And we've seen now 38 states have ratified this themselves. And yet we're seeing, attempts in other states to maybe rescind that ratification. But is this something that if the ERA isn't part of our Constitution, how are we seeing the rights that the ERA affords everybody? How are we seeing those playing out on a state-by-state level? I mean, do we have this piecemeal approach where if you're living in one state, you've got, more rights afforded to you than if you're living in another state?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's about 24 states have some version of an ERA in their state constitution. But, our military women and men get moved around, not at their own choices, and they should be covered the same regardless of where they're at. So one of the things that we are pushing is obviously this federal notion of equality of rights under the law. We actually think it'll be a much stronger basis than even many of the state ERAs, because they're written in a variety of ways, and the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in on some of those. And it wouldn't, obviously, it would go to their state Supreme Court. But having it come out federally and having it come out like this is the law of the land, and the Supreme Court says, all means all, y'all. So that's kind of our important messaging, because when we then take it down to any state, if you're being moved for a corporate transfer, or if you're being moved because something happened in your family and you need to go back and be closer to your parents, or you're with the military, you shouldn't have different rights just because you crossed state lines within America.
And put this in context with other countries, particularly, developed countries, what's happening in Europe, in terms of the US and its rights for all people, regardless of gender, regardless of sex. How are we lining up on the international stage?
It's depressing. So 168 countries include gender equality in their constitutions. We are the only major country that does not. I think most Americans are shocked when they hear that. From a gender equality perspective, as far as rankings, we've been dropping. We used to be kind of in that top 15%, and now we're from a bunch of different studies, we're below the top third. Some of them were in the bottom half. And when we talk about what's it going to take to close the gender equality gap, the estimate for America right now is over 200 years. The estimate for all the other countries on average is like 90 something. So we are doing very poorly. We used to lead on this issue back in the 70s, but then, we kind of lost our momentum, and we've had a lot of regressive conversations ever since. And we need to take this back as a priority for America.
Well, if this does pass the House, as it is expected to today, moving on to the Senate, I mean, for people who want to have their voices heard about this, what are some of the actions that can be taken? What are some of the actions that can be taken maybe at a state level? Maybe you're in a state that has been fully supportive of this, but maybe you're in one of the 12 states that has not ratified this. I would imagine there's a lot of activism happening in those states as well. What can people do?
So I would say your very first thing to do, the vote's happening at 1:30, so it's probably a little late to try to talk to your representative, but you should talk to your 2 senators. Everybody has 2 senators. So speak to your senators first, then start raising a lot of noise around this issue. One of the things we're going to be bringing out later this week is an action that anybody could do in their hometown. You could do it by yourself. You could do it with friends. We're kind of going with inequality is for the birds. It's going to be a birdhouse and bird feeder sort of guerrilla art installation opportunity. There are fun things that we can do as we raise the awareness, but what we need to be doing is always building that crescendo of people coming together and demanding gender equality in our Constitution.
And just as we wrap up, Katie, I mean, really, what is at stake here? You know, we've talked about inequities that we're seeing with the gender pay gap, and particularly for women of color who are so disproportionately impacted economically and otherwise because of the existing inequities. But what's at stake for our entire society if we don't ratify the Equal Rights Amendment?
So currently, we're actually out of sync with some of the international treaties that we have signed. So technically, from an international law perspective, we're not holding up our end of the bargain. So you can't really take any level of international leadership in an issue that you are basically breaking the agreements that you've already had. So we need to be moving this forward. We need to be reprioritizing gender equality. We need to be lifting up everyone, especially women of color, because they're living at that intersection of racism and sexism. And neither of those streets is a good street to be on. And living at the intersection of those is very difficult and challenging. So, you know, for us to have a better America and to regain a level of just really a level of priority and support internationally, we really should be moving this forward. We should be moving it forward with everybody in mind, and we should be celebrating it as we do. You know, it's been a long time to get to where we are. It still feels like we have a ways to go, but we really need to start celebrating the equality that we can bring forward into the world.
Well, that vote is happening in the House just in probably about an hour's time. It is currently being debated. People can follow the hashtags ERA now or ERA to get a sense of the debate that's currently happening. But this is just one more step, right, Katie? Because this would, as we have said, remove that arbitrary timeline so the ERA process doesn't have to start again. If it passes the House, and then if it passes the Senate, when might we expect this actually to be in the Constitution if those votes go the way that your organization is hoping they will?
I'm very hopeful that we would see the archivist add it actually as soon as so there's a whole other side with the Office of Legal Counsel in the DOJ. And so technically the archivist could add it or not add it, but we'd love to see him go ahead and publish it once the Biden administration has the new DOJ all set up, once they have a new head of their Office of Legal Counsel, and they have an opportunity to look at what we think was a fairly mistaken overreach by the executive branch. So we'd love to see it published with or without these votes in the House and the Senate, and that can happen. It could be that we see a House vote, then we see it published, and then we see a Senate vote. It could be that we have the House, then the Senate, then we see it published. Regardless, people are going to keep pushing. We're going to keep clamoring for equality, and we're not going to stop at anything. We stand on the shoulders of giants who didn't stop at anything, and that's where we have to keep going.
Well, Kati Hornung, it is great to have you with us on this day where we are seeing this being debated as we speak on the House floor. And of course, we'll continue to follow it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And next week on Free Speech TV's Just Solutions, we're going to continue our look at the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women, particularly women of colour. We'll be joined by the National Partnership for Women and Families to dig into what's happened with COVID and what legislation, what policies need to change, need to be enacted to really get to grips with the inequalities that we're currently seeing and that are just being exacerbated because of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's next Wednesday, same time, same place on Just Solutions.